What's up, Bomb Squad? It's Jason Sircone. It is episode 95 of Podcasting Strategy Simplified. And today we're going to take things in, I don't want to call it a different direction, but it's something that we've never talked about here on this podcast. So you probably are subscribed and you're listening to a lot of podcasts out there that also have a newsletter attached to it. As of today, at least as of us sitting down to record this episode today, yours truly has not ventured down that path. So to up my education on this, I decided to bring on someone that is known the world over for her podcast newsletters. Not only that, she's a podcast host. She's a podcast Hall of Famer. Also a first time having a Hall of Famer here on the show. So it's a pretty big day here on Podcasting Strategy Simplified. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the show Arielle Nissenblatt. What's up, Arielle?
Hey, I feel like I just got to say, what an intro.
Yeah?
I mean, yeah. First of all, just thanks for saying all those things about me. It's great. Second of all, just if it flew off the tongue, you know, I go on a lot of podcasts. I also produce a lot of podcasts, and the ability to maybe have a few bullet points written down and then to go from there to connect the dots from one to the other is an underrated skill. And I appreciate how chill you were with it, with your hands crossed like that. You're like, very professional.
Our longtime audience knows this is how I roll. It's laid back. I got the arms up. I don't like to be too rigid. And you're absolutely right. And I will say this is something that, you know, over 11 years of podcasting, it's just something that I knew from the start when I found podcasting, this is where I wanted to be. I chalked that up to the radio experience that I had in college. But for me, it's always been something that I've dedicated myself to improving upon. So picking up a skill like that to be able to do a smooth intro, I've told my clients this. It's not easy. It's not something that you just snap your fingers and you're really good at it. Tell me what you think about this, because I firmly believe this. Outroing a show is one of the hardest things to do in podcasting.
For a number of reasons. Yeah. Mm-hmm. First of all, you know, are you recapping the show or are you promoting the upcoming? I've seen a lot of mistakes, but then I think the hardest part about it is how do you make sure that you are not losing people just by starting to recap, you know, or starting to go towards the end of the show. You know, you don't want people to drop off because theoretically you're going to say something that is additive to the conversation. But once the intro music starts playing, once you say, thanks for being here today, I hope you learned something, blah, 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 I'm going to want to drop off. So how do you write or improv or ad lib enough of a reason for me to want to stick around till the end?
I believe that it's much like the intro. If your intro is too long, you're going to lose people because you're just not getting to the reason they showed up. If your outro is too long, and something that I've seen happen many times is someone will start that, okay, well, we're going to get ready to wind down here. And then 3 more topics get talked about, 10 more minutes go on. Maybe a person heard that, like you said, and that was their cue to check out. They might have missed something incredibly important. So when you get to that wrap up, you just wrap up. Yeah. Get out of there. Get out on a high note, as George Costanza once said.
And listeners, are we on video?
We are on video.
Listeners, viewers, let us know how this intro is going. Have we jumped into the meat of it yet?
I know. I'm looking at the clock. We're almost 4 minutes in.
Is this too long? Let us know. Let us know.
What I've learned about this show is that at least as long as it applies to strategy, it's something that can be of value. However, I'm going to take that cue to say it's time to segue into the meat of today's conversation.
Let us begin.
Let us do this. So let's talk about newsletter strategy. As I said in the top of the show, Arielle, you have, at least from what I've learned about you, this is one of the big things that got you so wrapped up in the world of podcasting was building these newsletters and ultimately building lists of content that you wanted to consume. So let's talk about the newsletter part of podcasting, because I think it's an underrated asset that you can have as part of your show. But at the same time, it can be something that many podcasters might feel is an extra task or an extra chore. And if it's not curated properly, it's really not going to lead to the results that we're looking for. So let's start with the basics and tell us some of the mistakes that you see podcasters making in this realm of their strategy.
Yes, all great questions. I have been writing newsletters for a while, and I know a lot about setting them up and creating the landing pages and making sure that there's, you know, branded cohesion between all of the different parts of your podcast, and newsletter is part of that. I also have made newsletters for other people, for podcasters, but also for podcast networks. So a recap of all the episodes that came out this week through this podcast network, and also have done a lot of advisory on exactly what we're going to talk about today. And I think we're going to do it with an example, which is you potentially. So I will have some questions for you.
Okay.
My newsletter that I've been writing for 9.5 years is a podcast recommendation newsletter that has evolved over the years. Right now, and actually always, it's been 5 episodes on a theme, each week curated by a different person. Throughout the years, I've thrown in news from Pod News. I've had a partnership with Pod News where we do a few bullet points on what's going on in the world of podcasting. I've done different partnerships with podcast production companies to offer a podcast spotlight each week. I host a podcast, or it's on hiatus potentially permanently. I host a podcast that recaps, that's an interview with each of the curators and why they chose those themes. And at times I've used the newsletter in order to drive people to that podcast episode. And so that's like kind of where I want to take this conversation is your newsletter a way to get to the podcast? Is your podcast a way to get to the newsletter? Probably a combination of all of those things. And then I also write a bunch of newsletters about the podcast industry generally. I write on Substack. I write a newsletter called Podcast Plunge. I then also post that on LinkedIn because LinkedIn has a newsletter platform as well. I've played around also with Ghost, which is another newsletter platform. I've played around with many of them. Button Down. I use Beehive for my newsletter. And I've tested out a whole bunch of others. So I say this all to say, I hope we get into the mechanics of the newsletter as well. So not just the content, because a very popular question nowadays is like, should I start a Substack? Should I start a Substack? We'll get into that. We'll get into all of it. But a mistake that a lot of people make is just saying, I need to start a newsletter for my podcast. I'm going to slap it together. And then why is it not growing? Why is my newsletter not growing? Why is the newsletter not bringing people to the podcast? This is a similar question. This is a similar issue to when people ask the question, should I start a community for my podcast? And your community didn't ask to be started, or it was kind of a buzzword that you heard and you decided you needed to start a community for your podcast, when really a community kind of needs to start itself. And then you get to be the architect of that community, the person who puts it all together, who keeps it all together. But ultimately, you can't foist upon somebody a group that they should be a part of. They need to be raising their hands to be part of that group. Yeah. Similarly, for a newsletter, there needs to be a reason for somebody to check out that newsletter. And there needs to be something within that newsletter that is unique that they're not going to get on the podcast, and vice versa. I always say, your newsletter needs to be valuable in and of itself, to the point that if somebody were to discover it, they would not necessarily need your podcast to get the full picture. You're going to get something great in each issue of the newsletter that might be the only way that I want to interact with this person and with what they're putting out into the world. Podcast, same thing. You can point people to the newsletter, but don't necessarily expect people to go to it beyond, every once in a while they will, maybe a bunch of people will subscribe, and when they get the email in their inbox, it'll remind them to go check out your show. But another mistake that people make is setting up the newsletter and then having each issue say, new episode out now. Here's a transcript. Yes. Very boring, not actually additive at all to the whole picture around your show. Yep. Sure, it's the easiest thing you could do. I would rather you not do it. So those are some of the mistakes that people make, and maybe we can dive more into them, and I'm sure others will come up as we go.
Oh, absolutely. I feel that the newsletter strategy in many ways mirrors the podcasting strategy, to where you need to put time into actually growing on a foundation that you've taken time to build so things can actually develop in a positive way, versus just expecting the whole world to show up because you've put this thing out there.
Yeah.
So let's remove that sense of entitlement from it and understand that work is going to need to be put into this in order for it to work, or in order for it to grow.
Something painful is that to realize is that not everybody you don't deserve an audience. You have to work for that audience. You have to work to keep that audience. And it takes a lot of time. You've got to get people first of all, to come to you, to be so delighted by what you're saying and how you're saying it that they want to stick around. Yeah. And you've got to make the show that you want to make, sure, but that needs to balance with what your audience wants to listen to or watch or consume. And same with the newsletter. Just because you make it doesn't mean people will come. Yeah. Same with social media, same with making videos. This is a big part of content marketing. A lot of the advice that you'll see on the internet is how to grow your podcast. You need to write a blog. You need to be putting that out through a newsletter. You need to have a TikTok. You need to, so many different things that all in and of themselves also need to be marketed. That is a lot of work. It's not as simple as flipping a switch and having a newsletter that entitles you to something. You've still got to tweak all of the creative around it. And what I can do today is help you figure out what the building blocks are that will structure a newsletter that may be successful. But ultimately, you need to do a lot of guessing and checking and figuring out what works for your audience, what works for your potential audience, the people that you want to attract. And that's where a newsletter comes in, because now you've got this another piece to your content. You know, it's hopefully a little bit different from what you're putting out in the podcast, which means that it might attract different people who are more interested in reading. And maybe, sure, you can flip some of those people to listen to the show as well, watch the show as well.
I love this idea, and I know we're going to talk about this more, but I know I follow a couple of coaches who do this masterfully. Is their podcast is about a certain subject. Their newsletter might come out the same day or maybe a day or two later, but it's about something completely different. Now, it might have been something that they covered on their podcast weeks ago, but it's not the same thing being regurgitated in another format. So I'm not just reliving the podcast in written form or vice versa.
Yeah.
To me, that there's more value in building something in that capacity, because if I read your newsletter and it's something about the podcast, well, now what's my incentive to listen to the podcast? Right. If I listen to the podcast and it's the same as your newsletter, why would I read your newsletter or even open it or share it with somebody else? There's a science to this, and that's really what I want to tap into. Obviously, the building blocks, the foundation, the mechanics, this is all going to be incredibly important today, but it's the science behind it. That's always what enamors me, is there's this psychological way that you have to make this connection with people.
And then be reminded that you might be making the connection with some of your audience and it just doesn't resonate with others.
Also true.
And that's just always going to be the case with everything. Not everybody will love you all the time.
And I'm going to deviate from the path a little bit by asking this question, because this is why I'm such a fan of content repurposing. And we know the big conversation in podcasting right now is video versus audio, and what is video going to do to podcasting? And God, I do not want to go down that path, but what I've always felt is that if you have the ability to do both, do it. You don't have to lean into everything fully, but if you want to have something that you could pull out in the future, or even if you want to put it all out now, give your audience the opportunity to choose, because everybody is going to consume content differently. If I'm
don't get pissed off when your video doesn't get views because it's boring, because it's just two talking heads.
Yes, that's also true. That's why, again, I go back to the strategy part of this that's always why I go back to it, because these are things that you define first before you ever turn on a microphone, before you ever go live with a show. What does all of this mean for you and your brand? Are you going to want more from your video than your podcast? Is your podcast going to mean more than a written component? But clearly understanding and defining what each role or what each asset will play in the role of the growth, that's going to make for a better overall production. At least that's how I've always seen it. You're right. Like, you can't get pissed off in the beginning of any of this. You have to let things get life. You have to continue to push things forward so people can understand that you're here for the long haul and you actually have something of value for them to consume.
Another thing is, I do a lot of audits for podcasts. I listen to the show, I watch the show, I look at the social media, I look at the website. How is everything flowing together? Newsletter is sometimes a part of this. And I come back to the person that I'm doing the audit for with a bunch of suggestions. And a lot of them are work. Some of them are a lower lift, but they're still work. And the feedback that I get is, that is a lot. I've got a lot to take in. I didn't realize all of the things that I could be doing. And then I try to soften it and say, okay, here are the top 3 things that I would recommend that you do. And even still, a lot of people don't do them because they're hard and they require you to shift things a little bit. And then they're still thinking, why is my show not growing? And this is obviously not the case with every person that I've worked with, but sure. I'm acknowledging that it's very difficult to be given a list of things that you could be doing. Maybe you try a few of them, those few things didn't work, but what are all the variables that went into that? Like, say, for example, I told you that you need to, yes, you're already doing promo swaps with other shows, but maybe you need to look towards a different genre to do promo swaps with. And then when you do your promo swaps, I've heard the way that somebody else recommends your show on a different show, and you might need to coach them a little bit and say, maybe let's try this promo swap elsewhere in the show and maybe make it sound a little bit more natural. We're both going to shout out the shows more naturally. All of these things take work, and I know it's really hard, especially if you're a solo operation, but there are tiny tweaks that can make a difference, and that's why the long haul is so important, because you get more data to play around with, and a lot of people don't give themselves that time.
Yeah, exactly. That's the hardest part. I think statistics prove that too. We see so many people. I have to believe of all these podcasts that have landed in the podcast graveyard, there was probably some gold in those podcasts, but because they didn't give it time to breathe and continue to develop the idea they initially had, unfortunately, the world was not able to ever be graced with that great content.
Right.
It's unfortunate.
Right. Yeah. Right. Or that mediocre content that would reach somebody who needs it. You know,
also true.
I just feel like it's important to say, like, not everybody is going to make the best show ever, and that is okay. Yeah. You know, like, yes, everybody can make a podcast, and yes, everybody should try, if they would like to make a podcast, to make a podcast. Mm-hmm. Setting realistic goals is very important in this process, and figuring out who the show is for and knowing that the show is not for absolutely everyone is hugely crucial.
Back on episode 84, we talked about I gave everybody permission to suck at first, because you have to find your voice. I don't think anybody sits down on the microphone the very first time and instantly has it. There's just no lock like that. You have to sit down. You have to suck for a little bit. You have to feel what that's like. And then once you develop a voice, good things are going to start to come from that. And then you say, okay, that was good. Now I can lean into that. And you get that suckiness behind you. But that's a lot of the problem, is that many people don't want to put themselves out there like that, even if it's for a few episodes where they're just getting their footing and finding the best way to have a conversation. I think that part of it, I think it's great to look back. I was listening to an episode of this. I just rebranded the show 3 or 4 months ago, and I just went back and listened to one of the first episodes. I can already feel a difference in myself. And I've been podcasting for 11 years, but even over the course of maybe 15 episodes, I could see a difference in how I'm conversing with you or how I converse with my audience. It's amazing to feel that growth.
A big part of that is listening back to your own show. A lot of people don't do that. Yeah. It is, first of all, I think extremely a necessary part of the process is listening to other shows, watching other shows, and not just as a consumer fan, but thinking to yourself, what do you like about these shows? How do you feel their intro bridged into the conversation they were about to have? Do you like that? Would you want to do that? Would you want to do something similar but different? How do you like the way that they segment their show? Do they name the segments of their show, or do they kind of just jump from one to the other? How do you like where the music comes in? And would you do that differently? Would you have music that is obtrusive, or do you like something that's a little bit more underlying? All these things. I've been listening to podcasts for so long. I've been in the space for long enough. And also I was a fan first, majorly a fan first, before I started getting on a mic or helping other people get on a mic. And because of that, I studied the credits of when the shows would finish. And I would think to myself, oh, I really like the way that this producer does this thing. Let me listen to other things that they do, try to find patterns and similarities between them. And this goes for, if you're a coach and you're making a podcast that'll hopefully drive people to your coaching services, you should listen to other coaches, but you should also very much listen to the highly produced narrative shows that are made by these big production companies. See what they do, see what you like, and you might be able to take elements of those things and apply them to you. But again, this is homework, right? This is, to me, it's not homework. I love listening, and I genuinely think that you can learn something from it every single episode that you listen to. And I really just recommend that, even if you're saying to yourself, God, I don't have time for that, make time for it. If you want to make this show and you want to make it really something that will attract an audience and serve the audience that you already have, you really do need to do work. It's not just going to come to you. It's not a flip of a switch.
Yeah.
I Wembanyama, right? Victor Wembanyama. He does a lot of crazy stuff with warm-ups, right? Like some people are like, wow, his warm-ups are insane. Mm-hmm. I heard on a podcast recently that Gen Z, and maybe it's Gen Alpha, they're like, I don't know. People who are like in high school are like, Wembanyama tries too hard and that's why he's good. And I'm like, yeah, that's why he's good, because he practices. Sure, you find it cringy that he's a tryhard. Tryhards are awesome.
Yes.
You have to try hard. Sure.
Doesn't that scare the shit out of you? That scares the shit out of me for the future.
It's always been uncool to try, right? It's always been uncool to be earnest. But
I feel like that's an exact extension of work ethic, and these are the ones that someday are going to need to fill the pill jars that are going to keep me alive in the pharmacy. Like, that scares the hell out of me.
Yeah. But I mean, I think when I unlocked the ability to be earnest and like to walk up to producers that I loved and tell them that I loved their work. And then nowadays I just actively, I'm cringy on the internet. I don't care, because that's the kind of stuff that works. And it's the kind of stuff that shows that you care. And I think we all kind of need to unlock the desire to, listen back to our own episodes. It's a little cringy, but it is the kind of thing that will help you over time realize what you like and don't like about your delivery style.
Yeah. There is a lesson in that, and I've referenced this video before. Pat Flynn put it out, and he was doing a video where he was walking through the airport, and he was recording himself talking, and he said, people are looking at me, and I've gotten to a point in my life where I couldn't care less that they are watching me do this, because in 10 seconds, they are going to forget that they ever saw me, because they have their own shit to worry about. So they've moved on. And that's a lot of this as well. You think about putting yourself out there, or being a little bit cringy, or even going to that level of trying. You know what? You're going to get more from that effort and more from putting yourself out there and not caring what other people think, because 10 seconds later, it might have impacted them for a minute or two, but they're onto their own thing. They're back on their own path. So why cost yourself something that could help you grow?
When I started my newsletter in 2017, part of me was like, who am I to be starting this newsletter? I have never worked in podcasting. I didn't do radio in college. I didn't study marketing. I didn't study email marketing. I wasn't a writer on the internet. Who am I to be doing this? And I just did it anyway. And I sucked. I really sucked. If you look at early iterations of the newsletter, you would be like, that is so ugly. I sent it out first on Gmail, BCCing everyone. And then I accidentally CC'd people. And then I was like, God, I need to learn an email marketing service. So I did. And it was so ugly for about 5 years. And then finally I switched to a different service provider, and I hired somebody to create templates, and I made it happen because I wanted to professionalize it. And I was bad at first, but it was still something that people found value in. And that is what kept me going. So yeah, I like what you said. If you really want to do this thing, it's okay to suck at first, but while you're sucking, try to be a student of other people who may not suck.
Yeah. Well, and learn from your mistakes, and learn that. And I think it goes back to listening to your own content. If you're not listening to say, okay, I use the word like too much, or too much. I had a friend that was on one of my podcasts way back in the day, and she didn't realize that her normal everyday way of talking was like a Valley girl, because she would like this, like that. And then she listened to the podcast, and I did not edit those out. And she said, my God, do I need to work on that?
And I'm sure also that she was her own harshest critic.
Sure.
But still, it's something that you hear and you say, okay, I want to fix that. One thing that I find myself doing when I'm interviewed on podcasts is I say, I think, before I say something that I know. And I don't know why I say I think. So I will actively pause and say, you know what? I don't think that I know it. And that's
smart.
That's a piece that because I'm calling it out publicly, it helps me mitigate it in the future. Another thing that I've noticed about myself is that I end sentences a little bit up. And that's not a bad thing per se. I do think it's important to have different intonations and inflections in the way that you speak. But I also am sure about some things, and those things I want to end on an even tone. You hear how I did that? I didn't say even tone. Even tone. So those are some of the things. I definitely, not to host your own show, but newsletters.
Yeah, I damn it. I wanted to.
I know we're having a good conversation.
I wanted to have this real clean segue, but I also wanted to drive home the point of how that inflection drives home authority.
Yeah.
If you're asking it like this, it doesn't sound like you truly believe what you're saying.
Right.
So I'm going to say we're segueing, damn it, into newsletters as we were intended. So let's start from the beginning. Like I said, before we turn the mics on, Bomb Squad, I told Arielle I'm going to be the student today because this is something that I truly want to bring into my practices. I've done it before, and I know the mistakes I've made. We've already talked about a couple of them, but overall, I feel like this is something that can truly add value to you and the audience consuming this show. And I want to make sure I'm doing this right. So we have the foremost authority here on the show to walk us through how to do this right. Arielle, let's start at the very beginning. I'm your student. Do this how you would do it with anybody else. And if you have to charge me for this and send a bill later, we can talk about that.
My first question for you is, are you already capturing email subscribers on your website?
I am not.
Okay. So that's huge. That's number one.
Yes.
So you've got your website, you've got this podcast, right? You do have a landing page for your podcast, a website for your podcast, and for your business around it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
So do you have a subscriber capture form for your business?
I have more of it's more just signing up for a discovery call in that I'm capturing their information that way.
Maybe you add a checkbox there that says, do you want to subscribe to my newsletter for insights and tips?
That's actually one of the questions on the intake form.
Great.
Well, that's one way that I've gathered emails. Yes.
So that's one way that you're going to start gathering emails. Another way is make a form for yourself. This is like if you have time for nothing else, go to Beehive, go to Ghost, go to Button Down, go to Substack if you want to, and create just a subscriber capture form. So you'll need the logo, you'll need the name of the newsletter, you'll need a one-liner description of it, a few other details, metadata, things like that. And then what you'll have is on Substack, it'll be like name of newsletter.substack.com. If you're on the free version of Beehive, it'll be name of newsletter.beehive.com.app, potentially newsletter. Anyway, it'll be a branded thing unless you decide that you're going to pay for Beehive or for Button Down. Ghost has a free trial, but it will shut down after 14 days and your newsletter will be gone. So you probably, if you're going to use Ghost, which I like, you're going to want to decide to pay for it if you're going to use it. So you're going to create that and then start putting it on the internet. Put it in your link in bio, put it in your show notes, start talking about it on your podcast, put it in your email signature, start mentioning it. I have a newsletter. It's not live yet, but what you'll do is you'll have people subscribe and then they'll get a welcome email. That's like, thank you for signing up. I appreciate you being here. What do you want to learn? What are you curious about? How can I provide value for you? Naming the newsletter is interesting because in some cases it might make sense to use the same name as the podcast, but in others it won't. So let's just talk as if we are from the beginning. Tell me the name of your podcast and what you're thinking for the newsletter name.
I like the name Podcasting Strategy Simplified as an extension that could also be the newsletter because I think that the content that would be found within, I don't want to use it to preview today's episode like we talked about earlier. I want it to be something that maybe goes back to my archives. Yeah, so maybe I go back 2 months and find I did this episode about episode flow. So now I take that and I make a newsletter out of that. So it's still taking that strategy simplified idea, just putting it in newsletter form. So I would probably stay pretty close to that name. I
think that's a good idea. That's a good shout, generally speaking. What I would watch out for is that those are words that a million other people are using, right? I can think of off the top of my head, there's a newsletter called Podcast Tech Stack. There's another one called Podcast Strategy Weekly. There's a bunch. Any podcast coach probably has a newsletter that has something similar. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. There's probably some ways that you can get in there and personalize it. So maybe it's like Jason's and then name of newsletter.
Let me ask you this, Arielle, because I know the big thing, the big flip for my show when I rebranded it was all about the podcast SEO. And I was able to gain visibility by having more of that keyword-driven name and keyword-driven show description, author field, all the good things. So with a newsletter, I'm assuming, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not, it is similar.
Yeah.
Well, okay, see, that's where I would think taking away something that people or
you definitely
for.
want something that people are searching for. But what I'm saying is you don't want those words. You don't want somebody to type in those words and then find somebody else who's ranking for the exact same keywords.
Right.
So it's a balance here because those are very popular keywords.
Okay.
You know, so
your suggestion would be to try to stay as close as I can, but also add a little bit of variation to
something
it,
a little bit different. So maybe it's like with Bomb Squad or, you know, I'm just trying to add something that you have branded as yourself. Bomb is probably not a good word to put in an email subject line because it might get, filtered out. But but those are some things to think about. Is you definitely want your keywords. You want the ones that are associated with you. But if I'm searching podcast strategy newsletter, yours is probably not going to be the first to pop up.
Right. Is it work like anything else over time, but with consistency, I could gain traction? But then I might be playing a longer game. Yeah.
I mean, and you should be playing the long game anyway, right?
Oh, for sure. For sure.
But yes, if your newsletter is, if you're sticking to those keywords, you've got a strategy in place. It's similar to the podcast strategy, keyword strategy, where you want enough traffic so that people are coming to your newsletters, that the search engines are ranking highly. They're liking what you're writing, and you're popping up for those things. But again, there are always going to be people who are going to put money behind their articles, and theirs are going to pop up first.
Right.
You're also potentially competing with Buzzsprout and Riverside and a whole bunch of different podcast softwares and services that have blog posts that are writing about similar things.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
But, Substack, Beehive, a bunch of other newsletter platforms, and Substack and Beehive would not like that I'm calling both of them newsletter platforms. I can get into that in a second. They have internal search engines and abilities for you to find readers and fans within them. So like Substack, for example, if I'm somebody who has a Substack account and I want to start a podcast, I could go to the search bar and I could say podcast strategy. And if your podcast might pop up, your newsletter might pop up. Your podcast also might pop up because you can technically also, host your podcast there. So lots of things to consider. There's a robust search engine within Substack. Beehive has a pretty robust recommendation engine, so you can recommend other newsletters. Substack does as well, but Beehive, generally speaking, is my preferred newsletter service provider, newsletter operator system, because you get to own it. When you start a Substack, people, should I start a Substack? You're not saying, should I start a newsletter? You're saying, should I start a Substack? Substack looks like Substack. It does not look like you. Beehive, you can do whatever you want.
Okay.
Ghost, you can do whatever you want. Button Down, you can do whatever you want.
So you've mentioned these four a few times already. So I want to.
And there are way more.
Oh, I know. And that's what I want to differentiate now. So, I mean, I'm thinking old school, but MailerLite, MailChimp, Constant Contact, are those still viable, or should we be looking at some of these newer ones?
It depends what you're going for. Is it a newsletter first, or is it something that is being channeled into a larger business? ActiveCampaign, it's great if you are a software company that needs to get people into automations and drip campaigns, and eventually you want to upsell them for something. It's not necessarily the look and the feel and the vibe of, here's an essay that I wrote that eventually leads somebody to check out the podcast that, I'm building a community on. Those are more for sales. MailChimp has features that are optimized for sales. That's what I used for 5 years when I first started my newsletter. And I had a lot of trouble customizing it in a way that looked professional.
Okay.
It really is made for people to buy a product, sometimes right on there, or to be linked out to something. That's why I switched to Beehive. Also just because their community was very early. The people that work for Beehive love working for Beehive. You can tell. I started with them in 2021. And the reason I started working with them is because somebody reached out and was like, I saw your newsletter on MailChimp. I wonder what it would look like on Beehive. And I was like, okay, fine. I'll entertain this. Had a call with them, eventually decided that there was enough of a reason for me to check it out. But yeah, I mean, MailerLite is something that people consider within all of that. Flowdesk is another one. There's a bunch that are worth looking into. There are also a lot of newsletter service comparison charts that you can check out. So I would definitely consider that as your figuring out what to do, because a lot of them have a free tier up to X number of subscribers, but that free tier means that it's going to be branded with their branding. So you need to take all of that into account as you're figuring out, do you want to professionalize this right away, or do you want to test it out a little bit before you decide you're going to do that? So there's a few other things to consider, like look at the terms and services, see what you can do in some that you can't do in others. Substack, for example, you can fully use Substack, capture emails. I mean, this is something that it's a little bit iffy, but something that I'm doing there is I use it. I'm active on the social media aspect of Substack, but I'm not necessarily active on there for sending a newsletter. Two of my newsletters I do send from there, but one I capture email subscribers for Earbuds for my main newsletter on Substack. And in the welcome email, I basically say, thank you for subscribing. You're not going to get this email on Substack. You're going to get it through, I don't necessarily say Beehive. You're going to get it through this email. Mm-hmm. And I just have them find me there because it's a really great tool for discovery. I have a bunch of other newsletters on Substack that are recommending me. So I get a couple dozen subscribers each week on Substack that then get an email that I'm going to add them to my list on Beehive. So you can fully take advantage of all of the wonders of Substack without tying yourself to it. And the reason you might not want to do that is because you don't necessarily own your stuff there. You own your stuff a little bit more with Beehive or with some of these other newsletter service providers.
Okay. I might be jumping ahead because I know we're going to talk about the content of this, and maybe this is a good way to lead it off. Something that I've noticed, and this is just through my own experience and also talking to others about newsletter click-through rate. I can remember doing campaigns, and this wasn't necessarily about what I do today, but things I've done in the past. It would get anywhere from a 40 to 45, maybe even close to 50% open rate on the emails. But the click-through rates were garbage. And I've talked to others that have said they've had the same experience to where they can't get anybody to really click through, or if anybody does, like maybe a very small percentage of the people that
it's always going to be small.
So my question is, because that was just the conclusion I made, is everything should happen within this newsletter then, right? I shouldn't be trying to get somebody off to a website. Yeah, because if it's all happening, if they're opening it, they're proving that they like to see what's happening here, but they don't want to go to that next step. So why don't I just give them whatever the next step is here? Am I right in how I'm thinking about this?
Somewhat. And again, this is probably something I would test from week to week with different things. It could be that you want to weed out a lot of people, and this offer really only works for some people. So the ones who are really engaged are going to click to the next thing. So I guess it depends what that call to action is. Yeah, sure. You might want to put the call to action in the newsletter itself. You might want to put that really juicy tidbit in the newsletter itself because it just provides value. But another thing is something that I've noticed over the years and that I proved recently, at least among the people that subscribe to my newsletter. I just put out a study on this in honor of the 9th anniversary of my newsletter, is that with podcast recommendation newsletters like mine, a lot of people use it to scroll and to be exposed to something new. They're not necessarily going to listen right then. They are clocking it. They're thinking to themselves, okay, I saw this podcast elsewhere. I saw it on my podcast listening app. I am curious about it. I may decide right now to click on it and listen to it, but more likely I'm reading the newsletter while I'm on the subway and I don't have service. So I'm going to clock this. It's subconscious. And then later when I'm on my podcast listening app and I see that podcast again, I'm going to listen to it. I, as the writer of that newsletter, do not get that click. But the person who is discovering that podcast is still discovering that podcast. So I don't necessarily think click-through rates are always the full story.
Okay.
That is definitely an important thing to think about. But also, I gave you the case study for me for my podcast recommendation newsletter. But this might work for a lot of people who are starting a newsletter to go along with their podcast. And you're thinking, oh, why didn't people click on this? And also, why didn't my listens go up right away after I sent this? It's because, again, same with social media. You put the perfect post on social media at the quote unquote perfect time. Still doesn't mean that the people who are seeing it are ready to listen to your show right then. They're clocking it, subconsciously thinking about it. They got value from it. Awesome. That's the best thing you can do.
Yeah. Okay. So we've gone through the myriad of options that we have in regards to a platform to use. We've decided we found the best one that's going to help us. We understand that click-through rate doesn't tell the whole story. But let's talk about the content within that newsletter. As I said before, in my mind, the way that I would want to carry this out, I don't want it to be this, hey, this is what's happening on the show, or right. I don't want to send it a day later and say, this is what happened on the show. Again, giving people reasons not to listen to my show. So let's talk about the overall content, what works, what doesn't. And again, I'm sure that's probably going to be different for everybody.
Ain't that the truth?
if you could cast a wide net in some respect, what's the best way to think about this as we're putting it together for the first time?
I'm going to give a less involved play that you can make, and then I'm going to give a much more involved play. What's great about a newsletter is that it allows you to add visual components that you maybe have on your video podcast. But if you have an audio show and you want to give people something to see that maybe you describe on the show, that is something that you can do. So if you're thinking to yourself, gosh, now I need to start a newsletter and now I need to write essays. No, you don't. You get to, if you talked about a bunch of recipes, you can show images of those recipes with a slight annotation from that. If you had a conversation with somebody on your show and they said something particularly controversial, you can take a snippet of that transcript, put it there, and then annotate your thoughts on it. So these are things that you've already done that will still provide value, that give you a little bit more to look at. So another thing is, and just speaking of other visual things that you can do, you can also, and then this is, you know what, I'll skip this, but if you have me back to talk about video and visual components of a podcast,
let's lock it in. We're doing this.
Well, I was just going to say, a lot of people, what is a podcast? Video, audio, whatever. Who cares? That's my thought. Yeah. Do whatever.
Episode over.
Do whatever makes sense for you and for your listeners and for your viewers and for your consumers, whatever. Yeah. If you decide that you don't have time, bandwidth, resources, whatever, to fully go video production studio, you can still provide visual components that are interesting, that allow your consumers to use their senses to figure out who you are. One is a newsletter that shares images. Another is chapter artwork, episode artwork. There are ways for you to channel what something looks like without having to use full-on video. So I really like newsletters for those purposes. It could also be a place where you house some clips that you are going to post on YouTube, but this is another way for people to see what it is that you're talking about. But let's go back to the content of the newsletter. So images, great. You could also use it as a way to say, I would actually never, I'm not going to say never because this might work for you, but in a lot of cases, I don't like to write in the podcast this week, on the podcast this week, we talked about X, Y, and Z, but really just get into the X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Again, because you want people to not feel like you are just repurposing this for them, even though you might be. So get into the essay component, and maybe an essay, but more likely it's okay to do bullet points. If you go to my newsletter, it is very skimmable. And I do that by design because there are so many people who have so many things to look at on the internet. Why are you the thing that they're going to spend a ton of time with? If they prove that they are going to spend a ton of time with you, or if that is your thing, make that your thing. But I know that for me, I'm a skimmable newsletter. It might be the case for you. So bullet points might be the thing that makes sense for you. And those bullet points might be, here's how I got this person to say yes to, or here's how I found this person that I wanted to interview. I discovered them on this podcast. They talked about this. I disagreed with this thing. I really wanted to have them on to argue with them. Here's what we discussed. And here's my conclusion from it, that maybe I drew on the podcast that conclusion, but maybe here's a more in-depth analysis of it. So that's something you can do. I subscribe. I'll give a few examples of newsletters that I think are doing complementary content very well, but not necessarily like, go listen to the podcast. There's a newsletter that I subscribe to called They Had Fun, which I actually think could be named a little bit better because you have no idea what that's about. But it's about this woman, Rachel, who lives in New York City, who gives people recommendations of things to do in New York City. So it's always 2 things that she did this week that were awesome, and here's how you can do them. So what she does is, in the newsletter, it's always those 2 things. But then the latest episode, which is linked, is not about those 2 things. It's a conversation with somebody who had fun in New York. So those are different things. They're interesting. They play well together, but they're not the exact same thing. I'm going to get something out of this. I'm going to get something out of this. And they're both very cool and are going to give me an idea and make me fall more in love with this idea of New York City. So I really like that she does that. There's a newsletter called This Is Important. It's about climate change and all of the things going on with the environment, and also about like regulation, really anything around the environment and green technology and all that. And the podcast is a deeply involved, reported, investigated experience with interviews and with narration. And then the newsletter is different, but complementary. It's essays, it's bullet points, it's resources that they're checking out. So it gives you another perspective. It gives you extra things to check out, to discover. And maybe it points back in some way to the newsletter, to the podcast, but not necessarily. It gets people interested. It gets people more enamored with what you're putting out into the world. Maybe eventually, if you have a live show, they're curious about checking that out, and they don't necessarily need to have listened to the podcast in order to go to a live show where you're talking about the things that you're also talking about in the newsletter. So those are a few examples of newsletters that I like, that have a podcast alongside them, that have a newsletter to go, a podcast alongside the newsletter to go alongside the podcast. In some cases, you can't tell chicken and egg. And I think that's okay.
I'm thinking about this from my perspective of what I would want to do. And with one of the driving themes of this podcast is that people walk away feeling as if they learned something. Maybe they didn't learn everything, but they learned something that they can apply, and it helps them move just a little bit closer to where they want to be. I would think the newsletter would play that exact same role. Once they read through that content, now they can, you know what? Yeah, there's a tip in here that really resonates with me. And that, to me, it does, again, if it plays well with the podcast episode, maybe that episode's linked, maybe it's not. But either way, I feel like putting the two almost on equal playing field, but then having just the fact that, knowing the fact that some people like to listen, some people like to watch, some people like to read, it hits all of those boxes, and it allows people to choose their own adventure, as I've said many times here.
There is a newsletter called For the Interested. It's by a guy named Josh. I've been subscribed for many years. It is literally one line, a sentence, each issue, and it's every day. And I subscribe, and I open most of them. And that's something that you can do, is a one-line email. It's essentially a text message, but it allows you to say, I mean, honestly, for your show, you could do something like, if you take one thing away this week, it is : and then it's the one thing that you want people to take away, right? And sure, you could then 100%. Expand on that. If you decide you want to do more than one line, you could expand on that. But that is bottom line up front. Do you know that term, bluff?
I think I understand the concept of it. Just from you saying it.
Apparently it's a military term where it's just like, tell people what the thing is, then explain. So rather than like, hey, it's so great to meet you. I'm wondering if you eventually might want to come on my podcast. It's like, I would love to have you on my podcast. And then enter line break. Hi, my name's Jason. I recently had this conversation with somebody who led me to you. I'd love to invite you to be on my show so that we can talk more about X, Y, and Z. So give the people at the top what it is that you want from them, then explain. That could be an interesting way to have your newsletter.
I think you've simplified all of the things in podcasting. Think of the ridiculous podcast pitches that we get, where it's just this 12-paragraph dissertation of validation of why I should be on your show.
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, it has nothing to do with the show because people are terrible at pitching. But there is something in that. To me, I've always felt like just starting the conversation is going to get so much more in regards to results and giving people what they want right away. Yeah. I don't need to read through 4 lines of crap to get to what I came here for. I don't need to listen to 10 ads and a 20-minute monologue before you get to the reason I clicked play on your podcast.
Yeah.
Get to the freaking point.
Give value as quickly as possible.
Yes.
And for some people, value is a full essay. For example, there's a podcast called Articles of Interest. Do you know it?
I've heard of that one. I'm not subscribed to that.
From 99% Invisible, which is a great show. Been around for a really long time, about design and architecture and the built world. And in 2020, they started a series called Articles of Interest about clothing. But it's obviously about way more than clothing. It's like how clothing shapes our lives, and plaid, and how plaid came to be, and the preppy style and history behind that. It's very cool. The host of the show is Avery Trufelman, and Avery also writes a newsletter that, again, in and of itself is valuable. And The newsletter is essay form, and it's sometimes in depth about the things that she talks about on the show. Sometimes it is a little bit related, but what I think is really great about this is that is what her audience wants from her. And she knows that because she's been making stuff for a long time, and she has fans who have told her these things. And because every time she puts out an issue of the newsletter or the podcast, she gets feedback. Not all of us are lucky enough to get feedback every single time, or enough feedback that it, causes us to make a change. But over time, you'll get feedback, you'll make iterations. Your version of that may not be a long essay. It might be bottom line up front. If you take away one thing this week from, and you don't even have to say the name of the show, you can say podcast strategy tip that you should try, and then here's the thing, here's how, and then maybe your next segment is here's how it worked for me. And then your next segment is here's how it worked for a client of mine, or whatever.
Yeah. I think the common denominator here that we really need to drill home, and I want to, but before, okay, I'll do this. Then I want to get to frequency, because I think that's an important part of this too. With everything we're doing, newsletter, podcast, social media, we live in a world, at least right now, where we have a lot of freedom. We have a lot of freedom to do what we want to do, and ultimately do what our audience is asking us for. There's not a lot of censorship. There's not a lot of, well, I can't do it that way, because lean into that.
Yeah.
Find what works, find what your audience responds to, and then double down on it. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Like, you get something that really pops, you don't want to say, okay, that was great, and then try something new. Like, oh, okay, that's what my audience has been waiting for. Let me give them more of that. That's going to lead to them telling others how great we're doing here. It's a beautiful world when you really think about it.
Yeah, there's no network telling you your episode must be 31 minutes. You get to do whatever the hell you want, but also maybe the network is the people who are consuming, and they're not necessarily dictating. You still need to make the show that you want to make. You need to make the newsletter that you want to make, that you can make time-wise, resource-wise. But yeah, how does the audience fit into that? How does the existing audience fit into that, and to the hopeful potential audience?
100%. So as I said, frequency, big part of this. So I think I've seen all kinds: daily, bi-daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. I think this, I'm not trying to jump ahead. In my mind, I'm thinking weekly for what I want to do. That seems like a pretty good cadence. I think you're on a very similar cadence, if not.
I am, but my cadence has nothing to do with your cadence.
No. I was just saying for conversation.
Yeah.
That's where I was going with that, is find the cadence that works for you, so it doesn't feel like a chore to put this article out there.
It could be monthly. It could be monthly. If it's hard for you every single week to put out an episode of your show, I used to really preach consistency every single week, no matter what. At the same time, it depends what your show is about, man, and what your goals are. I have some clients that they just want to have a podcast so that they can be on the same screen capture, Instagram Reels, TikTok videos, LinkedIn, videos that you post with potential clients, or with people that look like they just want to be in conversation with those people. They have a podcast. They distribute that via RSS and via YouTube. But the point of it really for them is to raise their profile, in which case you could have a show however often you want. And you could also use that fully as an excuse to have conversations with those people and not really care about your download numbers. So sort of similar to me with the newsletter, is like, put it out as often as you can, as you want to, that works for you to fulfill these goals. And you might see advice on the internet that's like, you must do this. That shit really pisses me off. Sorry, am I allowed to curse? I can say it again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Fuck it.
It really pisses me off when you're told that you must do something one way. And you've alluded to this a little bit, that, you're going to give people what works for you. It always depends. You need to figure out what it depends on for your unique case to then make decisions for yourself. A lot of people don't want to hear that, because it means that there are infinite possibilities that may or may not lead to their show or newsletter skyrocketing to the moon, but it is necessary.
Yeah. I think when you do something that is built around what you love, a lot of times it's around your business. At least folks we're talking to, you've started your business, or you've built your business because it's something that you believed in. You felt like it was something that the world needed, and your message is another way that the world can help solve the problem. If you love that message, if you love that brand that you've built, then being in a position to talk about it on a platform like a podcast or a video, that should be fun. That should be something that you're looking forward to. And you have, again, like we said before, a lot of flexibility to work within those confines to find the right way to deliver said message. So I'm 100% on board with the fact that we live in a very beautiful world, that we're allowed to find the right way to do things, and the frequency is completely up to us. We don't owe it to anybody at the end of the day to be there every week. Now, again, you don't want to just abandon your audience. I'm not giving that hall pass here. Like, don't be consistent. Your audience will still show up. No, there's lines and boundaries you have to pay attention to.
Yeah, you need to decide if
you have to decide what those are.
Is important to you.
Exactly.
And again, like if you're making a show, if your audience, for example, expects guests that are in this general arena, and you're bringing them guests in this other general arena because those are the people that you want to be in business with, do your thing. Do your thing, do your thing, do your thing. You may be alienating these people, but if you're eventually reaching your business goals, that's your prerogative.
Yes, 100%. So you had mentioned mechanics, and we're getting close to the end of this, and at least in regards to the questions that I had. What regarding mechanics, what was the thoughts that you had around that aspect of newsletters?
Just the infrastructure, choosing the newsletter service provider, figuring out what your onboarding workflow is. It's different for different types of podcasts, different types of projects. It could be that first of all, subscribe to a bunch of newsletters to see how they welcome you, what their welcome sequence is. Is there an ask right away? Is it hit subscribe on the podcast? Probably not, because maybe at the beginning, at least, a lot of them are coming from the podcast. Not necessarily, but you'll play around with this a little bit. You can get more sophisticated with this over time. If somebody subscribes from, you can set up automations that are like, if somebody subscribes from this link, this specific link, it means that they came from Substack. And if that's the case, then they maybe don't know about the podcast. If they subscribed via this link, which was on a partner's website, that means that more likely than not, they are this demographic, which means that they are curious about X, Y, and Z. You can also set up surveys for when they join. You can ask them what they're looking to learn. You can ask them to reply to this with an idea for an episode. You can ask them any number of different things. And these are definitely smart things to set up from the beginning, so that you are segmenting your people a little bit, so that if eventually you have offers for them, if you have a business or if you have an event upcoming, you want to figure out who's in Charlotte, North Carolina, so that you can get people to that event.
Wow, now there's a segue into the Empowered Podcasting Conference, August 21st to 23rd in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Imagine if I was like, what?
This has been awesome. I typically do not ask this question because it's usually something that stumps people, but what didn't we cover? Was there anything important that our listeners, if they're thinking about applying a newsletter to their strategies, should know that we have not talked about in the last hour?
Always tons of things that we did not cover. I would never say, yeah. Thank you for that. I do need direction sometimes. We did not cover subscriber growth, beyond just potentially capturing people that are coming to your website, or people that are clicking on the link in the show notes, or that are clicking on it in your bio or your new, email signature. How do you actually get new people? Honestly, it's pretty similar to how you do it with podcast listeners, podcast consumers. It's a lot of cross promotion. It's a lot of setting up different landing pages that have the email subscriber form on it, so that, if people search for your keywords, read an essay that you wrote, at the bottom of it, you got your newsletter there. A lot of what people call lead magnets. So figuring out what's the thing that's going to bring people to this spot. There's also free downloads. Do you want people to download something? Maybe it's like a checklist to start your podcast, but in order to download that checklist, they need to subscribe to your newsletter or give permission to receive your newsletter. So setting up a lot of these, very important. There are tons more, but I'll leave it on a sweet little cliff note.
Well, this is all great stuff. And again, my recommendation to anybody that's taken in this episode is to connect with you to learn more. Obviously, the resources that you put in place. If you want to see how good newsletters work, just subscribe to Arielle's newsletters, and you can see how she's formatted these things. That's been years of experience and years of talent all come together to create what you put out on a weekly basis. And it's great stuff. It's a tremendous resource for the podcast world. Thank you for providing that for us.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words.
You're welcome. So as we wrap things up, Arielle, again, it's been a great time. Tell the Bomb Squad one place they can find you to get the most value.
LinkedIn. Just search for my name. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll make it easy. I'll put that in the show notes.
Nice.
That's going to make life easy for everybody. So Bomb Squad, thank you so much for being here. And Arielle, again, thank you for taking the time to educate me, educate all of the audience, and help us make newsletters a more active part of our lives.
Thank you for hosting me.
I do what I can. All right, Bomb Squad, thank you so much for being here again. This has been episode 95 of Podcasting Strategy Simplified with Arielle Nissenblatt. Until our paths cross again on the next episode, this is Jason Sircone reminding you that podcasting isn't easy, but it doesn't need to be complicated. We'll see you next time.
What an outro.
Like that?